Hey guys, tonight we begin with architecture. The kind that was designed to outlast wars, plagues, and tenants with terrible hygiene. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Before castles became romantic ruins for tourists and Netflix dramas, they were Europe's way of saying, we've completely given up on peace. After Rome collapsed, civilization took a several hundred-year nap. The continent turned into a free-for-all of raids, revenge, and bad personal hygiene. Everyone with a sword wanted land, and everyone with land wanted walls. Thus, the Motte and Bailey was born, a wooden fort on a man-made hill surrounded by a fence, because nothing says impenetrable defense like slightly elevated lumber. These forts were cheap, fast, and about as durable as a breadstick. Fire was their greatest enemy, followed closely by wind and the occasional angry goose. If a rival lord didn't burn it down, the weather eventually would. Medieval builders called them temporary. Raiders called them kindling. Eventually, someone had the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, buildings designed to survive attacks shouldn't be flammable. Enter stone, the medieval version of an upgrade patch. Stone didn't burn, didn't rot, and looked intimidating enough to make peasants stop asking for raises. But stone came at a price. It was expensive, heavy, and required a small army of masons, engineers, and disposable labourers. Construction could take decades, which was fine because most lords didn't plan to move anyway. And once finished, that stone keep was more than just a fortress. It was the medieval equivalent of posting, "I own this valley and possibly God favours me." The Normans took this to Olympic levels. After invading England in 1066, they built castles everywhere, sometimes just to mark territory, sometimes just for the fun of scaring locals. It's estimated that within a century, there were over 1,000 stone castles dotting the landscape, all declaring, "Welcome to feudalism, population, you." Early stone castles were ugly but effective. No comfort, no plumbing, and windows smaller than your phone screen. They were fortresses first, homes second, and damp caves third. But they worked, because nothing says, "Do not invade," quite like a wall thick enough to outlive your grandchildren. The wooden fort had been humanity's hopeful shrug. The stone castle was its grim, magnificent middle finger. Once the first stone castles rose, medieval lords realised something crucial. Safety was nice, but showing off was even better. Building a castle wasn't just about surviving sieges. It was about advertising your superiority in high-definition masonry. Every tower, turret and portcullis screamed, "I'm richer, smarter, and slightly more paranoid than you." In an age with no Instagram, the only way to flaunt wealth was to literally carve it into the landscape. You didn't need followers, you needed battlements. Lords competed to outbuild each other, throwing ridiculous sums of money and unpaid labour at their projects. Castles became less about strategy and more about social status. Medieval skyscrapers for men terrified of irrelevance. The higher your keep, the greater your ego. And nothing said, "I'm untouchable," like forcing an entire village to look up at your house every morning while ploughing your fields. Feudalism was simple like that. The peasants worked, the lord built towers, and everyone pretended this was God's idea. But don't think every lord was a military genius. Many were just rich men with too much free time and a fear of being conquered by someone with better taste. Some built castles in terrible locations, bogs, cliffs, flood zones, because they looked dramatic. Function was secondary to aesthetic domination. After all, who cared about fresh water when your castle cast a shadow on your neighbours? Inside, things weren't much better. Most lords lived in constant anxiety, not from invaders, but from realising their servants knew where the food was kept. They fortified their dining halls, locked their bedchambers, and invented indoor arrow slits purely out of trust issues. Yet, for all their paranoia, these lords created masterpieces. A single castle could employ hundreds. Masons, carpenters, smiths, and occasionally someone whose entire job was yelling at other people carrying rocks. The design process was brutal. No blueprints, no computers, just pure medieval guesswork and one unlucky apprentice holding a plumb line in the rain. By the 12th century, the castle wasn't just a fortress, it was the ultimate status symbol. Bigger walls, taller towers, deeper moats, a stone-shaped ego trip that could survive a siege, an earthquake, or a bad marriage. And the message was clear. Come for me if you dare. Just remember, my walls have walls. In the Middle Ages, one architectural rule reigned supreme. If you're going to build a castle, put it somewhere annoying, preferably on a hill, steep, windy, and absolutely miserable to reach. Why? Because gravity, that ancient and unpaid bodyguard, worked best when it was on your side. Every step an attacker took uphill meant less breath, less dignity, and a greater chance of dying before even seeing the front gate. The logic was brilliant in its simplicity. A hill gave you the advantage of visibility, defensibility, and smugness. From up there, you could spot invaders days before they arrived and spend the extra time deciding whether to fight them or just mock them from a distance. Lords loved that part, the ability to point down and say, "You can try, but you'll regret it halfway up." But while it made sense strategically, it was pure suffering for everyone else. The builders, hauling tons of stone up goat paths, cursed the day their lord learned about elevation. Supplies had to be dragged uphill by oxen who, by the second trip, were probably reconsidering evolution. Even servants hated it. Imagine carrying dinner up 3 terraces, stairs, and a drawbridge, just to be told the lord wasn't hungry after all. The aesthetic payoff, though, was undeniable. From below, the castle looked divine, majestic, unreachable, a literal monument to superiority. From above, it was damp, draughty, and perpetually covered in fog. The view was great, assuming you could see past the clouds sitting on your roof. Not every castle was on a perfect hill, of course. Some were built on cliffs, because gravity was apparently too subtle a threat. Others perched on river bends or rocky ridges that were more dangerous to the occupants than to the enemy. Still, the higher the better. Medieval lords had an obsession with altitude rivaled only by modern real estate developers. Ultimately, the hill wasn't just for defence. It was a psychological weapon, a daily reminder to every peasant that power lived above them. Literally. The castle on the hill wasn't just a fortress. It was a statement. You can see me. You'll never reach me. And if you try, the hill will kill you first. Nothing says, keep out, quite like a giant ditch full of disappointment. The moat, Europe's most ambitious puddle, became the ultimate accessory for lords who wanted both safety and bragging rights. In theory, it was brilliant. A wide, water-filled trench made it nearly impossible for invaders to reach your walls. Siege towers couldn't cross it, ladders slipped in it, and soldiers sank in it. It was, essentially, medieval anti-personnel landscaping. In practice, though, it was mostly mud, mosquitoes, and regret. Early moats were rarely the picturesque blue ribbons seen in fairy tales. Most were just deep, filthy trenches filled with stagnant water, dead fish, and whatever the locals accidentally dumped in there. They smelled like divine punishment and looked worse. But hey, if you were an attacker, that smell alone might make you reconsider your career. Not all moats were watery either. Some were dry, filled with spikes, rocks, or other creative deterrents. A dry moat was cheaper, easier to maintain, and far more likely to break your leg. Medieval engineers loved the idea of enemies falling into a ditch so much they sometimes built 2. Why stop at one bad idea when you can double down? The real genius of the moat wasn't physical, it was psychological. It told would-be invaders, "You're not even close to my wall, and you're already losing." From across the trench, defenders could safely hurl insults, arrows, and the occasional leftover dinner. It wasn't just defence, it was theatre. Of course, moats also came with maintenance problems. They flooded in the rain, froze in the winter, and occasionally drowned the castle's own livestock. Draining them was a nightmare, and if your castle didn't have a nearby river, congratulations. You now had an enormous empty ditch that mocked you every spring. Still, no self-respecting lord would skip a moat. It was the medieval equivalent of a security system, mostly useless, but it made you feel important. And when guests arrived, you could casually mention how bandits never make it past the water. Which was technically true, because most of them got stuck, lost a boot, and went home ashamed. The moat, a triumph of fear, vanity, and bad drainage. In the medieval world, the gatehouse was the architectural equivalent of a fake smile, polite on the outside, murderous on the inside. It looked like an entrance, but it was really a trap disguised as courtesy. Every castle had one. You'd see it from afar, tall towers, banners flying, drawbridge down, sunlight glinting on stone, and think, wow, what a welcoming sight. 5 minutes later, you'd be lying under it, full of arrows and regret. The gatehouse was a masterpiece of defensive psychology. It combined deception, geometry, and gravity in ways only a paranoid medieval architect could appreciate. The moment an invading force crossed the drawbridge and entered the tunnel, the trap closed. Portcullises dropped, gates slammed shut, and suddenly, congratulations, you were in a stone hallway designed to kill you. Above you, murder holes, charmingly named openings through which defenders could drop rocks, boiling oil, or, on budget days, just anything heavy. On both sides, arrow slits, allowing crossbowmen to turn that confined space into a medieval blender. The gatehouse was less an entryway and more an automated shredder powered by human screams. Defenders loved it. Attackers hated it. Even couriers probably developed trust issues from delivering mail there. And yet, despite all this brilliance, castle designers couldn't resist overcomplicating things. Some gatehouses had multiple portcullises, just in case the first one wasn't traumatizing enough. Others featured drawbridges over secondary moats, forcing attackers to juggle ladders, siege towers, and self-esteem simultaneously. But the best part, the gatehouse doubled as living quarters for the guards. Yes, the same place where boiling oil occasionally rained from the ceiling was also someone's office. Imagine trying to sleep, knowing that at any moment your ceiling hatch might open and a flaming boulder might roll through. Still, no feature defined the genius of castle design quite like the gatehouse. It was both architecture and theatre, a stage where overconfident invaders learned humility and defenders got front-row seats to the carnage. The drawbridge may have said, "Welcome," but the gatehouse always followed up with, "Just kidding." It was the medieval version of customer service. Polite until you tried to enter without permission. Nothing in a medieval castle was built by accident, especially the stairs. Those narrow, twisting, ankle-breaking nightmares that made you question both gravity and God. They weren't bad design. They were genius cruelty carved into stone. Most castle staircases spiraled clockwise going up. To the average medieval visitor, that meant inconvenience. To a defender, it meant physics with a vendetta. Since most soldiers were right-handed, attackers climbing upward found their sword arms pinned to the central column, while defenders above could swing freely. It was the architectural equivalent of fighting someone in a hallway shaped like a corkscrew. You were doomed before you started. These weren't comfortable broad stairs either. Each step was uneven in height and depth, perfect for tripping anyone foolish enough to run. In peacetime, servants cursed them. In wartime, soldiers died on them. Either way, the builder got his money's worth. And just to add insult to injury, staircases in castles almost always narrowed as they rose. That made it impossible for more than one attacker to climb at a time. Essentially a medieval version of take a number. If you were lucky enough to make it to the top, you were exhausted, dizzy, and already halfway through your life expectancy. Some castles even reversed the spiral direction in different towers, just to confuse invaders. Imagine breaching a fortress after days of siege, sprinting up a staircase and realizing, halfway through, your sword no longer fits the geometry. That's not just defense, That's psychological warfare with steps. It wasn't all about combat, though. Spiral staircases were space-efficient, tucked into towers and keeps like stone tornadoes. They saved room for more essential things, like storage, bedrooms, or, more murder holes. Of course, living with them was less glorious. Lords, servants, and guests climbed these medieval vertigo machines daily, often while carrying food, armour, or chamber pots. Slipping wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially fatal. Still, the spiral staircase endures as one of the most diabolically clever inventions in history. An elegant blend of mathematics, murder, and inconvenience. In short, it wasn't bad design. It was bad intent. If you've ever toured a castle and wondered why the windows are so tiny, congratulations, you've just spotted the medieval version of a machine gun nest. Those narrow gaps in the wall weren't for sunlight or fresh air. They were arrow slits, and they turned archery into an art form of casual homicide. On the outside, they looked like paper-thin cracks, barely wide enough for a dagger blade. But step inside, and you'd see the brilliance. The slits were wide on the interior, giving archers plenty of room to aim while keeping themselves nearly invisible to the enemy. It was the architectural equivalent of trash talk, with no consequences. Attackers could shoot thousands of arrows toward the wall, and 99% of them would just ping off the stone. Meanwhile, the defender inside, dry, smug, and slightly underpaid, could calmly return fire with pinpoint precision. It was medieval efficiency at its finest. One man, one slit, and dozens of new ventilation holes in the enemy ranks. And they weren't all simple vertical cuts either. As siegecraft evolved, so did the slits. Cross-shaped openings for crossbows, circular holes for early firearms, and even angled designs for covering specific approach routes. The medieval architect wasn't just building walls, he was designing an interactive experience of despair for invaders. Of course, all this came with side effects. Castles were dark and cold, because sunlight was basically outlawed in favour of defence. Inside, you'd bump into walls, furniture, or other people long before you saw them. And when the enemy wasn't attacking, those same arrow slits were just great ways to let in rain and drafts. Still, they worked. A handful of archers could hold off entire armies, protected by geometry and good craftsmanship. It was engineering so effective that some castles used fake arrow slits, just carved into the walls to make the fortress look even deadlier. Nothing says confidence like pretending to have more firepower than you do. Arrow slits were simple, silent, and soul-crushingly effective. From the outside, they whispered, "We see you." From the inside, they muttered, "Try your luck." And from a safe distance, everyone else said, "You know what? Maybe we siege somewhere else." If the castle were a body, the keep was its heart, cold, overbuilt, and constantly under stress. It was the Lord's final refuge, the architectural equivalent of Plan Z. When every other wall had fallen, when the gates were gone, and the moat was now just a communal swamp, the survivors retreated here to wait for salvation, or starvation, whichever came first. The keep wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for panic. Thick stone walls, narrow staircases, and doors so heavy they could double as gym equipment. There was no privacy, little warmth, and zero insulation, just echoing corridors and the smell of damp authority. At the top sat the Lord's Tower, where he could look down on both his enemies and his employees, often with the same level of suspicion. These towers were watchpoints, bedrooms, and existential reminders that absolute power comes with chronic paranoia. Lords would pace along parapets, muttering about loyalty, while their servants froze 2 floors below. The genius of the keep lay in its simplicity. Everything essential, food, water, weapons, and people you didn't trust, could be crammed inside. If the castle fell, the keep became the last stronghold. Defenders would rain arrows, boiling oil, and creative profanity on anyone who got too close. Some keeps even had trapdoors in the upper floors, because gravity, once again, remained the best security system of the Middle Ages. But for all its brilliance, Living in the keep was misery disguised as prestige. It was dark, smoky, and cold enough to make penguins file complaints. Fireplaces barely warmed a few feet in front of them, and smoke vented wherever it pleased. By winter, you weren't just defending your castle, you were fighting off frostbite and lung damage. Still, the keep was genius in concept. A single, centralized bunker built before bunkers were cool. It represented power, endurance, and sheer human stubbornness. Every stone said, "You can kill us, but you'll get tired first." And while lords like to call them strongholds, everyone inside knew the truth. They weren't fortresses of confidence, they were fortresses of constant anxiety. Because nothing says medieval luxury like eating cold stew in a tower while pretending you're not terrified. If the medieval castle had a soul, it was trapped somewhere between the curtain walls. Those massive outer defences that wrapped around everything like a stone hug built by people who didn't believe in hugs. A good curtain wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a psychological statement. It said, "We don't trust you, and we're proud of that." Thick, tall, and built with zero mercy, these walls were designed to outlast not just wars, but weather, time, and the Lord's latest financial crisis. The brilliance of the curtain wall was its layered defence. Many castles had not one, but 2 or even 3 rings of them. If you broke through the first, congratulations. You were now stuck in what defenders lovingly called the killing zone, an open courtyard designed for maximum regret. Arrows, rocks, boiling water, take your pick. It was the medieval version of a free trial you instantly regretted signing up for. The walls themselves were works of art in misery. Sloped bases made siege engines slide off. Rounded corners deflected projectiles. Walkways on top allowed defenders to stroll safely while raining chaos below. Even the spaces between towers were carefully measured, ensuring archers could cover every angle. No blind spots, no mercy, no fun. And while all this looked intimidating, it came at a price. Building curtain walls was painfully slow and ruinously expensive. Quarrying, cutting, hauling, and stacking thousands of stones required years, sometimes decades. Whole generations of peasants lived and died carrying the same wall up the same hill for the same man who taxed them to pay for it. Truly, the circle of medieval life. But once complete, the curtain wall turned a castle into a fortress of legend. To an invader, it was hopelessness incarnate, an endless loop of grey stone whispering, "You'll die tired." To the Lord, it was art, the physical manifestation of pride, paranoia, and perfect symmetry. And to everyone else, it was just another reminder that medieval architects were equal parts mathematicians and psychopaths. Because no matter how impressive your siege engine was, the curtain wall always had the last word. That word was denied. If the castle was the masterpiece of medieval defence, the siege was the messy fan art trying to destroy it. Every wall, tower, and gate inspired new ways to break them, and thus began the most underrated scientific rivalry of the Middle Ages: engineers versus gravity. Early attackers relied on enthusiasm and bad ideas, mostly ladders. A few brave souls would sprint toward a 40-foot wall, holding what was basically a tree branch, hoping the laws of physics were on vacation. They usually weren't. After enough broken spines, someone finally said, "Let's use math." Enter the trebuchet, the Middle Ages answer to, what if we built a catapult that could ruin a city's day from half a mile away? Using counterweights, leverage, and pure spite, these machines could fling 300-pound stones with terrifying accuracy. Entire teams of engineers were devoted to calculating angles, mass, and velocity, turning destruction into geometry homework. Then came the battering ram, which was less scientific but equally expressive. A giant log on chains, swung rhythmically against a gate until something, usually the soldiers, gave up first. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine spending years building the perfect door, only to hear it splinter under the weight of medieval teamwork. Defenders, of course, fought back with equal creativity. They poured boiling water, hot sand, or oil from the murder holes, whichever was cheapest that week. Some even built secondary walls inside the first, forcing attackers to start over like a sad historical rerun. But for all their intelligence, medieval siege tactics were also hilariously slow. Some sieges lasted months, others years. Entire armies would camp outside a castle, watching the defenders grow thinner and angrier until both sides simply got bored and signed a truce. In many cases, hunger won before heroism did. Still, every siege taught something new: how to build better walls, stronger bridges, smarter angles. The arms race between stone and science shaped centuries of warfare. It was never about strength alone. It was about who could think faster, aim better, and get the math right before running out of food. And thus, medieval warfare proved what students still know today: math hurts. From the outside, a medieval castle looked majestic: towering walls, fluttering banners, the very image of power. Inside, it was basically a damp refrigerator filled with shouting people and questionable hygiene. Life in a castle wasn't glamorous. It was loud, cold, and perpetually smoky. The walls that stopped catapults also trapped drafts and cooking fumes. Every room smelled faintly of wet stone, wood smoke, and the faint despair of everyone who couldn't afford to leave. The grand great hall, where lords feasted and made speeches, was the heart of it all. And by heart, we mean chaotic open-concept nightmare. It doubled as dining room, courtroom, party venue, and occasionally battlefield. Dogs wandered freely. Servants tripped over armour. Someone was always yelling about taxes, and someone else was always asleep under a table. Heat was a luxury. Fireplaces the size of small houses struggled to warm even a few feet of space, while everyone else huddled near the flames, smoking their lungs before winter could finish the job. Windows? Tiny slits, good for archery, useless for light. Candles helped, but only if you enjoyed paying for fire hazards. The toilets, or garderobes, if you want to sound classy, were basically holes in the wall with a drop straight down the side of the castle. Ingenious for the time, horrifying by any modern standard. Some emptied into moats, turning your defensive water feature into a biological weapon. The smell alone could repel armies. Food was abundant, but rarely appetizing. Fresh meat was for nobles. Everyone else got whatever could be boiled beyond recognition. Bread doubled as plates, which doubled as compost. And if you thought a medieval diet sounded bad, imagine medieval dentistry. Despite the misery, people were proud to live inside. To the outside world, the castle symbolized privilege and safety. Inside, it symbolized survival by stubbornness. You endured the cold, ignored the rats, and pretended the dripping ceiling was ambiance. Yet for all its flaws, the castle was the beating heart of medieval life. A monument to paranoia and endurance. It kept you alive, even if it slowly drove you insane. Living in a fortress meant one thing: you were safe, uncomfortable, and mildly smoky, but at least not dead. Castles weren't just fortresses, they were reminders. Massive, immovable, impossible to ignore. Every stone whispered the same message. Someone richer than you lives here, and he owns everything you can see. For lords and kings, castles weren't built merely to defend land. They were built to control it. You didn't need to patrol every road when your fortress sat on the horizon like a divine threat. It was the medieval version of an influencer's blue checkmark: public, visible, and slightly insufferable. Each castle served as the physical embodiment of authority. The peasants ploughed beneath it, the merchants paid taxes because of it, and the local priest probably blessed it while quietly resenting it. The walls weren't just defences, they were propaganda. The message was clear: obedience is safety, rebellion is suicide. Everything about castle architecture reinforced hierarchy. The Lord's Chamber sat high above everyone else, partly for defence, mostly for ego. Guests had to climb endless stairs before being granted an audience, ensuring they arrived physically exhausted and emotionally submissive. Even the design of the Great Hall was psychological. the lord elevated at the far end, the peasants below, lit by smoky torches that made everyone look slightly guilty. The architecture also served a social function: surveillance. From the battlements, guards could watch every field, every road, and occasionally every questionable decision made by the villagers. If someone tried to rebel, the castle saw it first. If someone tried to flee, the castle watched them fail in real time. It was medieval security without the cameras, just people who never blinked. For the common folk, the castle loomed over daily life like a stone god. They built it, supplied it, and feared it, all while knowing they would never set foot inside unless something had gone terribly wrong. To the lord, the castle was home. To everyone else, it was a threat that never slept. And yet, in its cold brilliance, the castle achieved exactly what it was meant to. Peace through intimidation, loyalty through fear, order through architecture. It wasn't just a building. It was feudalism carved in granite. By the late Middle Ages, castles had done their job a little too well. Gunpowder arrived, cannons made walls feel inadequate, and suddenly all those proud fortresses looked less like strongholds and more like expensive rock collections. So the nobility did what the nobility always does when practicality dies. They redecorated. The once impenetrable castle evolved into something new, part palace, part status symbol, part overcompensating family heirloom. Thick walls no longer needed to repel trebuchets, so architects filled them with luxury, or at least the medieval approximation of it. Curtains, carpets, windows that actually opened. The horror. Defensive towers became bedrooms. Moats turned into gardens. Arrow slits widened into scenic views. A bold decision that would have made earlier generations of lords physically ill. Where once poured boiling oil, now poured imported wine. What was once a fortress became a fashion statement. The new buzzword was comfort. Central fireplaces spread warmth instead of smoke. Tapestries covered stone walls, partly for insulation, partly to remind guests that their host could afford someone else's embroidery. Kitchens grew bigger, not to feed armies, but to roast peacocks for dinner parties. The feudal age of fear was slowly being replaced by the Renaissance age of showing off. Of course, some lords couldn't quite let go of tradition. They still built mock battlements and fake arrow slits, not for defense, but for aesthetic intimidation. Nothing says wealth like a decorative murder hole. These castles were less about surviving a siege and more about surviving social judgment. By the 15th century, the castle had officially retired from warfare and joined the world of architecture as historic luxury housing. It became the medieval equivalent of a sports car, unnecessary, flashy, and mostly for impressing people you secretly despised. But there was genius in this evolution. The medieval castle, born from chaos and fear, had reinvented itself as art. No longer a fortress of war, now a fortress of taste. It stood as a monument to humanity's favourite pastime, turning survival into style. And while the cannons roared outside, inside, the lords were too busy discussing tapestry colour schemes to notice. For nearly 5 centuries, castles had been Europe's unbreakable insurance policy. Stone giants laughing at ladders and sneering at siege towers. Then one day, someone rolled up with a cannon and said, "Try me." Gunpowder changed everything. Those thick, glorious walls that had deflected rocks for generations suddenly folded like stale bread. What used to take months of siege could now be done in an afternoon with enough gunpowder and optimism. Medieval warfare evolved overnight, and castles, the ultimate defensive invention, went out of style faster than chainmail underwear. The irony was brutal. The stronger the castle, the louder it exploded. Builders had spent centuries perfecting geometry and gravity, and now both betrayed them. Cannonballs turned pride into rubble, towers into confetti, and keeps into smoking echoes of, well, that escalated quickly. Lords tried to adapt. They lowered walls, widened moats, and built earthen ramparts to absorb blasts. But by the 16th century, the writing was on the wall, and the wall was on the ground. The age of stone had given way to the age of science. As castles fell, palaces rose. If you couldn't defend your wealth, you might as well flaunt it. Architects traded battlements for balconies, arrow slits for stained glass, and drawbridges for decorative fountains. Power was no longer measured in fortifications. It was measured in chandeliers. The feudal lord was slowly replaced by the bureaucrat with better lighting. The old castles, once roaring with soldiers and smoke, turned into ruins, silent monuments to paranoia and craftsmanship. Some became prisons, others monasteries, and many just crumbled into scenic tourist attractions. Peasants who had once trembled at their shadows now picnicked in their courtyards. The fall of the castle wasn't a failure of design. It was a success of progress. Humanity had simply outgrown its stone cages. Cannons didn't just end sieges. They ended an era. And yet, even in ruin, castles refused to vanish. They lingered like proud ghosts of an age that refused to be forgotten. Because even when you blow them up, you still look up. That's the power of a castle. It never truly falls. It just waits for the next century to admire it. The castles may have fallen silent, but their stones never stop talking. Centuries after their builders turned to dust, the walls still stand, cracked, mossy, and somehow smug about it. They've survived wars, kings, tourists, and teenagers with spray paint. Not bad for buildings originally designed by people who thought bathing was suspicious. The legacy of castles isn't just military, it's psychological. They taught Europe how to think in stone. Every wall was a lesson in patience, every tower a statement of fear disguised as confidence. They weren't just fortresses, they were therapy sessions for an anxious civilization. Even in ruin, they command respect. Stand inside one today, beneath the cold archways, among the arrow slits and echoing halls, and you can feel it. The sheer weight of human paranoia, ambition and craftsmanship pressing down on you. It's like history itself whispering, "You would have died here." Modern architects still borrow from them. Symmetry, grandeur, vertical dominance. Skyscrapers are basically castles that discovered glass. Corporate headquarters too. Fortresses built to intimidate, not defend. The same instincts that shaped medieval battlements now shape office towers. Keep the power in, keep everyone else out. But beyond the symbolism, castles endure because they capture something primal. The human need to build something that says, "I was here." Lords, peasants, masons, all of them chasing immortality one stone at a time. Every brick was a defiance of time, an attempt to outlast the chaos that built it. And somehow, it worked. Today, they're backdrops for weddings, video games, and slow-motion drone footage, repurposed relics of human stubbornness. We romanticize them, pretending the past was noble and the drafty rooms were charming. The truth is simpler. Castles weren't magical. They were necessary, and in their necessity, they became beautiful. So, as the wind howls through ruined towers and tourists snap selfies where knights once panicked, remember this. Castles were never about perfection. They were about survival dressed up as art. They were fear turned into architecture, and in their silence they remind us of something we keep forgetting, that even the strongest walls eventually crumble, but the idea behind them never really dies. When people hear the words Roman orgy, they imagine rooms filled with excess, wine spilling, music echoing, and everyone losing control. But the truth is far less wild and far more political. Much of what we picture today came not from first-hand accounts, but from the pens of moralists, satirists, and Rome's political enemies. To them, accusing an emperor of indecency was the ancient equivalent of a smear campaign. The Roman word convivium simply meant a banquet, a formal dinner where elites gathered to eat, debate, and build alliances. These meals could be lavish, yes, but not all were scandalous. The ancient historian Pliny described dinners that ended early, with measured drinking and intellectual talk. Only at the very top of society did some feasts cross into spectacle. The idea of a Roman orgy, as later imagined, was an exaggeration, often designed to make powerful figures seem corrupt or unfit to rule. Writers like Suetonius and Tacitus described the darker side of certain emperors, Caligula's unpredictable cruelty, Nero's dramatic performances, and Elagabalus's love of ritual excess. But even these accounts must be read with skepticism. These authors served senatorial audiences who often despised the emperors they described. If Caligula invited nobles to a private feast, it could be reported as a night of sin, whether it was true or not. In Rome, perception was a weapon sharper than any sword. That's not to say Roman feasts were innocent. They were stages of power. A host's wealth was displayed through imported delicacies, flamingo tongues, sea urchins, or honeyed dormice. Guests reclined on couches, slaves served wine, and musicians performed. Yet beneath the perfumes and laughter, every conversation was political theatre. Friendships were negotiated, alliances forged, and rivalries exposed. Pleasure, in this sense, was a form of influence. Over time, later cultures, especially during the Christian era, used tales of Roman orgies as moral warnings. They became symbols of pagan corruption, not historical accounts. The legend of endless debauchery stuck because it was useful. It made the fall of Rome seem like divine punishment for excess. In reality, most Romans saw restraint, not indulgence, as the ideal. What we remember as wild abandon was often just exaggerated gossip from a civilization obsessed with appearances, ambition, and the fragile dance between reputation and desire. Every Roman banquet, from the grandest imperial feast to the humblest senator's dinner, was a performance, a silent war fought with glances, gestures, and goblets. To be invited was a privilege, but also a test. The host displayed power not through words, but through extravagance. From the marble floors to the imported spices, every detail whispered one message: I am wealthier, more cultured, and more connected than you. For the elite, food was a political weapon. A well-timed dinner could secure loyalty, silence an enemy, or show off imperial favour. The closer your couch was to the host, the higher your social standing. A bad seat, or worse, an empty invitation, could end a career. Roman etiquette was merciless. Cicero once complained that being served lukewarm wine was a personal insult. The dining room, known as the triclinium, wasn't merely a place to eat. It was a theatre of dominance. Wine, the symbol of Roman sophistication, flowed freely but carried danger. Too much could loosen tongues and reveal secrets. A witty toast could earn applause. A clumsy one could destroy a reputation. Roman elites were expected to strike a balance between pleasure and decorum, displaying indulgence without losing control. That tightrope walk defined the Roman ideal: luxury under discipline. Entertainment was part of the strategy. Poets recited verses, dancers performed, and sometimes exotic animals or jesters amused the guests. But it wasn't all laughter. Senators whispered about legislation, generals traded favours, and rivals subtly undermined each other through jokes disguised as compliments. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, a banquet could determine who rose and who fell. Yet behind the glamour, inequality was stark. While the aristocracy reclined on silk cushions, slaves stood motionless for hours, pouring wine or wiping spills in silence. For them, a banquet wasn't celebration, it was servitude. Still, the efficiency and elegance of the service reflected directly on the master's prestige. Even the slave's composure was part of the host's image. The Roman banquet, then, was never just about food or pleasure. It was a ritual of control, an arena where alliances were forged and futures destroyed without a single sword drawn. Each toast, each course, and each glance carried the weight of ambition, desire, and survival in the empire's glittering web of power. For Rome's ruling class, pleasure wasn't merely indulgence, it was performance art. To dine extravagantly was to announce your place among the powerful. Emperors, senators, and wealthy patrons, understood that their reputations were built not just in the forum, but at the table. Here, the art of feasting blended seamlessly with the art of manipulation. Every detail of a banquet spoke volumes. The cut of a guest's tunic, the rarity of the dishes, even the fragrance of the incense hinted at influence and refinement. A clever host could use these elements to send coded messages, demonstrating both wealth and restraint, generosity and control. True sophistication lay in knowing how far to go. Too modest, and you risked seeming weak. Too lavish, and whispers of decadence could spread through the city like wildfire. Nero, for example, mastered this delicate balance, until he didn't. At first, his feasts dazzled Rome with music, poetry, and innovation. He encouraged artistic display and surrounded himself with the city's creative elite. But as paranoia grew, his banquets turned theatrical in the worst way. Guests feared that one wrong word could turn a night of pleasure into a public humiliation, or worse, a death sentence. Pleasure under Nero became performance under threat, where laughter was forced and loyalty measured in applause. For the Roman elite, even acts of intimacy had political meaning. A well-placed affair or a whispered rumour could shift alliances faster than a law ever could. Women of noble birth, often dismissed by male historians, played crucial roles at these gatherings. Their influence, charm, and intelligence could elevate their families or ruin their rivals. Behind the polished silver trays and flowing wine, Rome's social machinery was in motion, subtle, dangerous, and endlessly calculating. Yet this obsession with image was not purely cynical. Many Romans saw pleasure as a path to divine connection. To experience joy, beauty, and abundance was to honour the gods who provided them. The convivium wasn't just a party, it was a reflection of cosmic order, where harmony, balance, and abundance symbolised a prosperous empire. Still, the line between sacred and sinful blurred easily. For every guest who sought refinement, another sought escape. In those candlelit rooms, surrounded by laughter and power, Rome's greatest virtue, self-control, was constantly at war with its deepest temptation, excess. When Gaius Caesar, better known as Caligula, rose to power, Rome expected another Caesar Augustus, a restorer of order after years of intrigue. Instead, they got a ruler whose banquets became infamous symbols of madness and extravagance. But beneath the scandalous rumours, his feasts reveal how the Roman elite used pleasure as political theatre, and how absolute power could twist entertainment into intimidation. Caligula's dinners were not simple meals. They were performances meant to display divine authority. Guests reclined beneath gilded ceilings, while perfumes filled the air, fountains flowed with wine, and dishes of rare delicacies, peacock brains, flamingo tongues, and pearls dissolved in vinegar, graced the tables. Every bite screamed of excess, but it was also propaganda. Caligula wanted his guests to see him not as a mortal emperor, but as a god among men. The spectacle reminded them that he controlled not just the empire's wealth, but their very comfort. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Cassius Dio painted these scenes as debauchery, but their motives were political. Both wrote long after Caligula's death, serving senatorial audiences eager to vilify tyrants. What they called immorality might often have been theatrical arrogance, a young emperor mocking the stiffness of Rome's traditions. Still, there's no denying that his feasts carried menace. It was said he invited senators' wives and mocked their husbands openly, blurring the boundary between hospitality and humiliation. For those present, every toast was a test of loyalty. To refuse a dish or hesitate to praise his performance risked offence. To flatter too eagerly risked ridicule. Survival required the precision of a poet and the patience of a slave. Many left the emperor's table smiling outwardly while trembling within. Behind the laughter, Rome's power structure was on display. The feast was Caligula's stage, and everyone else was an actor in his divine farce. By controlling indulgence, he controlled fear, and by mocking virtue, he reminded the Senate that he stood above their judgment. Whether or not every rumour was true, Caligula's banquets marked a turning point in Roman culture. They transformed the convivium from an elegant gathering of minds into a living metaphor for imperial corruption, where pleasure, politics and paranoia mixed like wine and poison in the same golden cup. If Caligula turned the Roman banquet into a weapon, Nero turned it into a stage. No emperor blurred the line between art and appetite more completely. He fancied himself a performer, a poet, and a visionary. His feasts were not just about food. They were carefully crafted spectacles where guests became both audience and props in his grand, self-directed drama. Nero's banquets often began with breathtaking theatricality. Rooms shimmered with candlelight reflecting off gilded ceilings. Perfumed petals drifted from hidden openings, while musicians played as guests reclined on couches of ivory and silver. The emperor himself frequently performed, singing, playing the lyre, or reciting verses he claimed to have written in divine inspiration. The night's true delicacies were not the exotic dishes, but Nero's insatiable need for admiration. But these gatherings were not without unease. The historian Tacitus wrote that guests dared not look bored, for indifference could be seen as insult. Applause was survival. Some feasts reportedly lasted from dusk till dawn, punctuated by endless courses of rich foods, roasted swan, honeyed dormice, and oysters imported from distant provinces. Slaves hurried through the halls carrying more wine than an army could drink, and even the air was heavy with spices from Arabia. It was indulgence elevated to performance, but it came at a cost. For Nero, spectacle was politics. By dazzling the elite, he sought to remind them that his creativity and generosity were unmatched. Yet the more he performed, the more detached from reality he became. His banquets mirrored the empire itself, magnificent, excessive, and cracking beneath its own weight. When famine struck Rome, these extravagant feasts took on a darker meaning. The public saw them not as art, but as mockery. Even the infamous Domus Aurea, his golden house, reflected this contradiction. It contained dining rooms that rotated like the heavens themselves, a symbol of divine luxury. But while the ceilings turned above him, the empire's patience ran out below. His feasts, once admired for innovation, became symbols of a ruler lost in fantasy. In the end, Nero's downfall was as theatrical as his reign. The man who treated life as a banquet found himself abandoned by those who once cheered his performances. His legacy reminds us how easily beauty can become excess, and how a love of art, when twisted by ego, can devour the artist himself. If Nero blurred the line between art and indulgence, Elagabalus erased it entirely. Crowned emperor at only 14, he brought to Rome a flamboyant spirituality that shocked the establishment. As high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, he saw no division between worship and pleasure. To him, feasting was sacred ritual, one that blended devotion, desire, and spectacle, until no one could tell where holiness ended and hedonism began. His banquets became legend. Ancient writers claimed that guests dined on dishes so exotic that even seasoned nobles were stunned. Camel heels, ostrich brains, and pearls dissolved in vinegar. Flower petals rained from the ceiling in such abundance that some guests reportedly suffocated beneath them, a story likely exaggerated but too striking to forget. Elagabalus adored shocking the elite. He would seat the most conservative senators next to performers, soldiers, and foreign priests, turning Rome's rigid hierarchy into a chaotic carnival. But beneath the absurdity was a strange kind of philosophy. Elagabalus believed that pleasure itself could be divine. By surrounding himself with beauty, art, and sensation, he thought he was honouring the gods who created them. His feasts, then, were not simply acts of excess, they were performances of cosmic unity. Unfortunately for him, Rome was not ready for such flamboyant devotion. What he saw as religious ecstasy, his subjects saw as madness. His disregard for Roman tradition went deeper than cuisine. He replaced Jupiter's statues with his own deity's symbol, married multiple times, and invited women and eunuchs to positions of influence. To conservative senators, these acts were unthinkable. His banquets became shorthand for chaos, an emperor too young, too foreign, and too reckless to rule. The gossip that surrounded him, stories of bizarre meals and wild behaviour, was less about food than about fear. Rome feared what it didn't understand. Elagabalus's downfall came as swiftly as his rise. In 222 CE, the Praetorian Guard turned against him, ending both his reign and his feasts of fantasy. Yet his legend endured. For centuries, writers used his name to symbolize decadence pushed to the brink of insanity. But perhaps, behind the exaggerated tales, Elagabalus was simply a dreamer, a boy emperor who mistook divine celebration for divine rite, and whose pursuit of beauty led him straight into oblivion. For centuries, tales of Rome's orgies have captivated imagination, but separating gossip from truth reveals a very different picture. Most of what we think we know about Roman debauchery comes from historians writing long after the events, men with agendas, biases, and moral lessons to teach. They weren't eyewitnesses to wild parties. They were commentators framing Rome's decline as punishment for moral decay. Writers like Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio used scandal as a literary device. When an emperor fell out of favour, accusations of gluttony, lust, or cruelty followed. It was the ancient equivalent of character assassination. By painting figures like Caligula, Nero, or Elagabalus as depraved, these historians reassured readers that Rome's crises were the fault of individuals, not the system itself. It was easier to blame feasts than politics. Archaeology, however, tells a quieter story. Excavations of villas in Pompeii and Herculaneum reveal dining rooms built for comfort and conversation, not chaos. Frescoes show guests reclining in small groups, attended by musicians and servants, but not scenes of uncontrolled indulgence. Tableware discovered in elite homes, fine glass, bronze, and silver, suggests elegance, not disorder. These were spaces of sophistication, where taste and decorum mattered as much as food. That doesn't mean excess was absent. Roman elites loved luxury and competition. They collected spices from Arabia, silks from China, and wine from distant provinces. But indulgence was meant to signal refinement, not vice. The goal was to display culture and generosity, not scandalize the neighborhood. The reality of Roman banquets was closer to a modern diplomatic dinner than a hedonistic fantasy. The confusion partly comes from translation. The word orgia in Greek originally referred to sacred rites, religious ceremonies involving music, dance, and emotional release. When early Christian writers adopted the term, they twisted it into something sinful. By the Middle Ages, Roman orgy had become shorthand for corruption, completely detached from its original meaning. In truth, Roman feasting was a complex social ritual, part politics, part spirituality, part art. The wild stories endure because they satisfy our appetite for shock and moral contrast, but the evidence points to something subtler. A culture obsessed not with chaos but with control, image, and the delicate balance between pleasure and power. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the story of its supposed decadence did not fade. It evolved. Early Christian writers, eager to contrast their faith's purity with pagan excess, turned the idea of Roman orgies into a powerful moral warning. What had once been political propaganda became spiritual symbolism. Rome fell, they claimed, because it drowned in sin. The banquet table became the altar of corruption. Writers like St. Augustine and later medieval chroniclers portrayed the empire's decline as divine justice. They described emperors consumed by lust, greed, and vanity, painting them as proof that paganism led only to ruin. These accounts weren't history, they were sermons. The exaggerated tales of naked feasts, drunken senators, and immoral rituals served as allegories of temptation and the dangers of straying from faith. To the Christian imagination, the Roman banquet wasn't about food at all, it was about the soul's hunger for discipline. This reinterpretation reshaped the empire's image for centuries. In medieval manuscripts and Renaissance paintings, Rome was reborn as the city of sin, its emperors standing as warnings to kings and nobles of every age. Caligula became the face of pride, Nero the symbol of vanity, and Elagabalus the embodiment of blasphemy. The historical nuance of politics and performance was erased, replaced by spectacle, vivid, moral, and unforgettable. By the time Enlightenment scholars revisited ancient sources, the damage was done. The phrase Roman orgy no longer referred to a banquet at all. It meant moral collapse. Artists and playwrights from France to England capitalized on this mythology, filling stages with togas, goblets, and scandal. Painters like Thomas Couture and Jean-Léon Gérôme revived the imagery of drunken emperors and collapsing morals, giving visual form to centuries of exaggeration. Yet this transformation tells us more about later societies than about ancient Rome. Every era projected its own fears onto the empire's ruins, about wealth, temptation, and the fragility of civilization. To the Victorians, Rome symbolized what could happen if moral restraint failed. To modern audiences, it represents the allure of forbidden pleasure. Thus, the myth of the Roman orgy survived not because it was true, but because it was useful. It became a mirror through which every age could examine its own desires and its own hypocrisy, while pretending to look only at the past. By the time the myth of the Roman orgy reached modern ears, it had travelled through nearly 2,000 years of distortion. What began as political rumour and moral storytelling had become a cultural shorthand for decadence. Yet the truth of Roman feasting lies somewhere between ritual and ruin, a world where beauty, ceremony, and excess coexisted in a fragile harmony. In ancient Rome, banquets were about more than appetite. They were microcosms of the empire itself, hierarchical, theatrical, and deeply symbolic. Every guest, every course, and every sip of wine reflected the balance between chaos and order that defined Roman life. Pleasure was not condemned, it was celebrated, but within limits. To eat and drink well was to honour the gods, one's ancestors, and the prosperity of Rome itself. Even the most luxurious feasts were governed by etiquette, structure, and meaning. Yet that balance was constantly at risk. When emperors like Caligula or Nero crossed the line between elegance and spectacle, their banquets became metaphors for the empire's own instability. Power turned ritual into farce. What began as harmony devolved into hubris, and hubris demanded punishment. The feast became an omen, a reminder that unchecked indulgence could devour even the mightiest civilization. Still, not all was decay. The Roman world gave birth to extraordinary culinary innovation, artistic refinement, and architectural grandeur. Dining rooms were adorned with mosaics of myth and nature, music and poetry filled the air. To dine in Rome was to engage in an experience of total art, where taste, sound, and scent merged into a single statement of culture. Even the humblest citizen aspired to imitate the elegance of the elite, if only in spirit. The ideal Roman sought moderation, temperantia, the virtue of balance. It was this principle, not chaos, that defined the core of their identity. Over the centuries, the myth of endless indulgence overshadowed that truth. The orgy became a convenient symbol for decline, obscuring the sophistication beneath the surface. In reality, Roman feasting was both a celebration of life and a cautionary tale about excess, a mirror reflecting the best and worst of human nature. In the end, perhaps the legend endures because it feels timeless. Every civilization, from ancient Rome to our own, must wrestle with the same question. When does pleasure become peril? And when does abundance turn into its own undoing? In the 10th century, far from the deserts of Baghdad, the Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan encountered the Norse traders known as the Rus. Among the clamour of iron, fur, and amber along the Volga River, he noticed something striking. Not their weapons or ships, but the women who stood among them. He wrote that these Viking women were adorned from the tips of their fingers to their necks with dark blue and green marks. To him, they seemed both mysterious and regal, bearing stories carved in skin. These markings were more than decoration. In Norse culture, Identity and faith intertwined so closely that the body itself became a living testament to both. A tattoo could declare one's lineage, devotion, or power, much like a saga told without words. Lines wound around arms like runic prayers. Spirals across the chest resembled the turning of the seasons or the spinning of fate. For Viking women, these designs likely reflected not vanity, but belonging to a clan, to a god, to the ancient rhythm of survival. The colours Ibn Fadlan described were also significant. The deep blue ink, likely made from ash, soot or crushed copper salts, symbolised endurance and divinity. In Norse myth, blue was the colour of ice and wisdom, associated with Odin's all-seeing eye and the eternal northern sky. To wear that hue was to wear a fragment of the world itself, to let one's flesh mirror the vastness of creation. The green tones may have been linked to fertility, growth, or the goddess Freya, protector of women, love, and beauty. Archaeological evidence is scarce, since skin does not survive the centuries. Yet fragments of tattooing tools, pigment stones, and carved combs suggest the practice was real and likely widespread. In Viking burials, scholars have found symbols carved into wood and metal that echo the same patterns described by Ibn Fadlan: loops, vines, and serpents devouring their own tails. These designs, whether on skin or stone, shared one message: that life and death were woven together in an unbroken circle. To the Norse, beauty was not fragile, it was fierce. And for their women, these tattoos were not rebellion or vanity. They were declarations of faith, memory, and endurance, marks of identity that would outlast even the snow and the centuries. To the Vikings, the body was not a blank canvas. It was a message. Every scar, braid, and bead told a story, and tattoos were the most permanent of all. For Viking women, body art functioned as both ornament and oath. It was how they carried the unseen, heritage, protection, and emotion, into the visible world. A tattoo could mark a woman's ancestry as clearly as a family crest. In a culture where oral history replaced written records, the skin became a living archive. A winding line across the wrist might represent a family's voyage across the sea. A knot around the neck could symbolize eternal loyalty to kin. These designs were not random. They were storytelling through geometry, where every twist echoed myths of fate and rebirth. The placement of tattoos held meaning, too. Hands and forearms, always visible during work or trade, displayed strength and skill. Necklines were intimate, reserved for symbols of faith or love, perhaps a rune for Thor's hammer, or an intertwined serpent to invoke the Midgard guardian. Some scholars suggest that certain designs might have been linked to rites of passage, coming of age, marriage, childbirth, or even mourning. A Viking woman's tattoos could thus trace the milestones of her life, like chapters in a personal saga. Runes often formed part of these designs. The rune Algi's, shaped like an upturned Y, represented protection, a spiritual shield against harm. Fehu signified wealth and prosperity, while Berkana, shaped like a birch leaf, stood for fertility and renewal. To ink these symbols was to invite their power, merging the physical and spiritual worlds. Tattooing itself was likely a ritual act. The process involved piercing the skin with soot or charcoal, perhaps mixed with oils or plant resin. It was not casual decoration, it was endurance transformed into devotion. A woman who chose ink also chose pain, and in Viking belief, pain had purpose. It connected the body to sacrifice, echoing Odin's own self-wounding on the world tree to gain wisdom. So when Ibn Fadlan saw those deep blue patterns shimmering against pale northern skin, he wasn't just witnessing art, he was seeing faith made flesh. Each mark was a whisper of belonging, a vow written in blood and ash, surviving long after the voice that spoke it had fallen silent beneath the snow. In the world of the Vikings, faith wasn't confined to temples or carved idols. It lived in everyday gestures, charms, and symbols etched into the skin. For Viking women, tattoos often carried spiritual weight, serving as both prayer and protection. Each design, no matter how small, was believed to guard the wearer against unseen dangers, disease, betrayal, ill fortune, or death at sea. Their ink was not vanity, it was armour. The Norse believed that the world was a dangerous weave of fate and chaos. Beneath every sunrise lurked the threat of cold, hunger, and loss. A tattoo, then, became a quiet act of defiance, a promise that one's spirit would not be swallowed by winter or war. Many designs borrowed directly from Norse mythology. A coiled serpent symbolized Jörmungandr, the world serpent who circled the earth, representing protection through eternal vigilance. A web-like pattern might recall the Norns, the three sisters who spun every life's destiny from birth to death. To wear such marks was to carry divine acknowledgement upon the skin. Some Viking women were known to invoke specific gods through tattoo motifs. Freya, goddess of fertility and love, might be represented by falcons or cats, her sacred animals. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, appeared as a rune or charm against evil forces. Odin's symbols, especially the Valknut, 3 interlocked triangles, were worn by those seeking wisdom, courage, or a peaceful death. These weren't mere decorations. They were prayers written in a language of lines and pain. The act of tattooing itself had ritual significance. A woman receiving a sacred mark might fast, chant, or call upon her ancestors during the process. The ink, often mixed from soot, ash, or crushed minerals, was seen as alchemical, binding body and spirit. It was said that a mark given in devotion was not just on the skin, but in the soul. Such symbols also protected in life's most vulnerable moments: childbirth, travel, and mourning. To carry protective ink was to walk with invisible guardians, reminders that the gods watched even in silence. In this sense, a Viking woman's tattoos were not for display. They were a pact, a promise between mortal and divine that faith, when carved in flesh, could never truly fade, even when the body returned to the earth. Tattooing in the Viking world was not a simple craft. It was a sacred art. Those who practiced it were more than artisans. They were keepers of stories and symbols, trusted to inscribe meaning onto the body with precision and reverence. Though their names have long since vanished from history, their influence lingers in the inked legends passed down through Ibn Fadlan's account and Norse myth alike. A Viking tattooist likely held a role somewhere between a healer, a priest, and a smith. The process itself required courage, both from the artist and the subject. With needles made from sharpened bone or bronze and pigments drawn from soot, ash, or natural dyes, each mark was tapped carefully into the skin. There was rhythm to the act, a quiet ritual that echoed the hammering of gods and craftsmen. The slow sting of ink became part of the initiation, a symbolic trial of endurance and transformation. Tattooing was usually done in domestic or ceremonial spaces, often accompanied by chanting, storytelling, or offerings. Some scholars believe these sessions took place during significant festivals, like Yule or Midsummer, when the veil between the human and divine was thinnest. To receive ink during such moments meant becoming part of something larger, a living participant in the sacred cycles of Norse belief. The designs themselves reflected the deep connection between art and survival. Patterns often resembled those carved into longships, jewellery, and wooden beams, uniting the body with the objects that defined Viking life. Spiral motifs symbolized continuity and rebirth. Runic inscriptions bound the wearer to gods or ancestors. For women, these tattoos were not hidden. They were displayed proudly on visible parts of the body, the hands, arms, and neck, announcing strength, beauty, and faith without a single word. Even trade may have carried the art of tattooing across borders. The Vikings' vast network stretched from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the warm markets of Constantinople. Along the way, they encountered the tattooing traditions of Slavic, Turkic, and Arabic cultures, perhaps blending techniques and symbols. Through these exchanges, Norse tattooing evolved into a reflection of a cosmopolitan world, one where identity, faith, and artistry met at the tip of a needle. Each tattooist, though nameless, left behind a silent legacy, a belief that stories are best told not only in words, but in skin that endures. If Viking tattoos spoke a language, their alphabet was the rune. These angular symbols carried power beyond mere letters. They were bridges between the human and the divine. To carve or ink a rune was not simple writing, it was invocation. Each one held meaning, purpose, and consequence. For Viking women, runes etched into the skin could bless, protect, or even curse, depending on intent. The runic system most associated with the Viking Age was the Younger Futhark, a simplified version of the older script used across Northern Europe. Unlike our modern alphabet, each rune represented both a sound and a concept, a cosmic truth bound to nature or the gods. Fehu meant wealth, not just material, but spiritual abundance. Algiz symbolized protection, like the spreading antlers of an elk, shielding from danger. Berkana embodied fertility, motherhood, and new beginnings, while Tiwas, shaped like an arrow, represented justice and sacrifice, honouring the god Tyr. To inscribe a rune onto the body was an act of faith. A woman who bore Berkana upon her wrist might be invoking safe childbirth. Another with Algiz along her forearm might trust it to guard her on journeys across icy seas. These symbols were not chosen lightly. They demanded respect, for each stroke was believed to echo through the unseen worlds. In Norse lore, even Odin himself bled to learn the secrets of the runes, hanging from the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 nights until the knowledge revealed itself. To tattoo them, then, was to mimic the god's sacrifice in miniature, to suffer briefly for wisdom and power. Runes also served as social markers. Among traders, they could signal allegiance to a clan or faith. Among healers, they symbolized the binding of energies, warding off illness or ill luck. Women often bore combinations of runes forming protective charms, like the binding runes found in later Scandinavian artifacts. These complex designs intertwined letters into shapes resembling vines or snowflakes, beautiful yet potent. Though few physical traces of these tattoos survive, carved stones, jewellery, and wooden relics suggest their visual vocabulary. Across time, the runes whispered the same message. That ink could do what words could not. It could bind fate to flesh. For Viking women, each mark was a spell, each symbol a story, and their bodies were the manuscripts of eternity. Not all Viking tattoos were made for war or worship. Some were born from the quiet ache of love and memory. In a world where death was constant and separation inevitable, tattoos offered a rare kind of permanence. For Viking women, whose husbands, fathers, or sons might vanish at sea or in foreign lands, the ink beneath their skin became a promise that love would endure even when flesh and bone did not. Archaeologists and historians have long speculated that certain tattoo motifs mirrored the emotional bonds within Norse society. A knotwork pattern could symbolize eternal union, its endless loops reflecting the belief that souls intertwined across lifetimes. Twin birds, perhaps ravens or swans, might represent lovers divided by distance, one flying over the waves while the other waited beneath the northern sky. A simple line winding from the wrist to the heart could signify fidelity, a mark known only to the one who bore it. The Norse concept of love was not soft or sentimental. It was fierce, loyal, and tragic. The sagas are filled with women who waited decades for a warrior's return, or swore vengeance for a slain husband. Tattoos became quiet extensions of those vows. Some may have carried runes invoking Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, while others bore the sign of Odin's ravens, linking affection to memory and wisdom. Inking these symbols was both prayer and protest, an act of devotion against the inevitability of loss. Death, too, was never far from love in Viking life. When someone passed, women often took part in mourning rituals that included symbolic offerings or markings. It's possible that tattoos were renewed or added during these rites, transforming grief into remembrance. The pain of the needle mirrored the pain of loss, binding the emotional wound into the physical one. so that both could heal, scar, and remain. To the Vikings, love was as sacred as battle and as binding as oath. Their tattoos, even the smallest, carried that same weight. Each mark whispered of longing, loyalty, and remembrance, of a love that refused to fade with the sun or with the years. In a culture that feared being forgotten above all else, to tattoo love was to make it eternal. While sagas often glorify Viking warriors, the truth is that many Norse women were merchants, travellers, and negotiators, carrying their culture far beyond Scandinavia. Some historians believe their tattoos reflected this reality, symbols of trade, prosperity, and worldly connection inked into their skin. These marks weren't just ornaments. They were credentials, signs of identity in a vast and often perilous trading world. The Viking Age stretched across continents, from the icy fjords of Norway to the bustling markets of Baghdad, Constantinople, and the Caspian Sea. Women frequently joined or even led trading expeditions, managing the exchange of furs, amber, iron, and slaves. In such encounters, tattoos could act as both conversation and currency. They communicated one's origin, beliefs, and reliability without a single word. A merchant woman adorned in blue ink was instantly recognizable, a traveller from the far north whose people valued courage and honour. The designs that accompanied these journeys often carried runic blessings for safe passage and fortune. Symbols of ships, waves, and spirals evoked the sea, the lifeline of Viking prosperity. Some patterns mimicked the carved figureheads of longships, believed to ward off evil spirits lurking in the mist. A spiral etched on the hand might represent both the turning of the tides and the cyclical nature of wealth. What is risked returns. Cultural exchange also left its imprint. As Viking traders interacted with Arabic, Persian, and Turkic artisans, new aesthetics entered their repertoire. Geometric motifs and flowing script found their way into Nordic art, just as Norse knotwork fascinated foreign observers. It is possible that Ibn Fadlan's famous account reflects this cross-pollination, a fusion of northern mysticism with eastern craftsmanship. For Viking women, these marks may also have carried social and spiritual meaning. A trader's tattoo could symbolize not only economic ambition, but divine favor, invoking Njord, god of the sea and wealth, or Freya, patroness of prosperity and fate. Every journey was dangerous. Storms, raiders, and betrayal lurked on every horizon. To bear sacred ink was to carry invisible protection. Thus, the merchant's tattoos told a dual story of commerce and courage, profit and piety. They marked not only where a woman came from, but how far she was willing to go. Beneath her skin flowed the map of an empire built not by conquest alone, but by ink, salt, and trade. Though much of what we imagine about Viking tattoos comes from trade and domestic life, there's another side to the story, the marks of warriors and wanderers. Norse women were not confined to hearth and hall. Some joined raids, defended settlements, or accompanied their kin on voyages across unknown seas. For them, tattoos became symbols of endurance, strength, and identity in a life where survival itself was an art. The sagas hint at women like Lagertha, the legendary shield maiden who fought beside men with ferocity and cunning. Whether real or mythic, such figures embodied the Norse ideal of balance, beauty and brutality, wisdom and wrath. Tattoos may have mirrored that duality. A spiral around the arm could signify the cycle of battle and rebirth, while a wolf's head on the shoulder evoked Odin's warriors, the unstoppable and the fearless. Unlike the decorative patterns of merchants or artisans, warrior tattoos carried ritual intent. Before battle, women might ink or renew protective runes, tiwaz for courage, algiz for defence, or sawilo for victory and guidance by the sun. The ink itself was often made from soot and ash taken from sacred fires or burnt weapons, making the tattoo both physical mark and spiritual talisman. To wear it was to bind oneself to fate, wired, the invisible thread of destiny the Norns wove for all mortals. Voyagers, too, bore their stories in ink. A woman who had crossed the Baltic or journeyed to the east might mark her skin with the sails of a longship or the silhouette of a raven, the messenger of Odin, symbol of intelligence and navigation. For her, tattoos were records of passage and proof of experience. Every mark etched on her body was both a compass and a confession. She had seen the world and lived to return. When Ibn Fadlan met Norse traders along the Volga, perhaps he wasn't seeing merchants alone, but survivors of such voyages, women who carried the ocean's memory on their skin. Their tattoos were not acts of rebellion, nor ornaments of vanity. They were declarations of presence. To be marked was to be known, to be counted among the living who had faced chaos and returned stronger. In that sense, their ink was their shield, silent, sacred, and unyielding as the northern sea itself. Time has erased the ink from Viking skin, but not the meaning behind it. The bodies that once bore those deep blue patterns have long since turned to dust, yet the stories remain, passed down through travellers' writings, artefacts, and the echoes of northern myth. Though archaeology cannot recover tattooed flesh, the tools, symbols, and sagas left behind tell us that these markings were far more than vanity. They were identity made visible, belief made tangible. In the frozen soil of Scandinavia, archaeologists have uncovered needle fragments, pigment stones, and mixing bowls that point to a widespread tattooing culture. Patterns carved into combs, jewellery, and wooden boxes mirror the very designs Ibn Fadlan described. Even in regions far from Viking homelands, Russia, Scotland, and Iceland, these same symbols reappear, linking people across time and sea through shared artistry. The absence of preserved skin only deepens the mystery, leaving imagination to trace the lines that once ran from finger to neck. Today, modern descendants and historians are rediscovering this tradition, reviving the Nordic ink as a way to reconnect with ancestry. Tattoo artists study rune stones, jewellery, and saga poetry to recreate what might have adorned those ancient women. Each line drawn today is both homage and hypothesis, a bridge between modern curiosity and ancestral pride. What was once lost to history has returned as cultural identity reborn, but perhaps the true legacy of Viking tattoos lies not in the patterns, but in the philosophy they embodied. To the Norse, every life was a thread in the loom of fate, and every act, from carving wood to marking skin, wove that thread deeper into eternity. Their tattoos reminded them that beauty could coexist with pain, that courage was quiet as well as fierce, and that meaning was something one had to create, not inherit. In Ibn Fadlan's brief description, we glimpse more than an observation. We glimpse a world view. Those blue marks, now invisible to time, once told stories of faith, family, and survival. They were prayers written in pigment, proof that even in the coldest corners of the world, humans sought to make their souls visible. And though the ink has faded, the message still lingers. To be remembered, one must first choose to be seen. When King Gentius took the Illyrian throne around 181 BCE, he became ruler of a kingdom both proud and precarious. The Illyrians, fierce tribes scattered along the rugged Adriatic coast, had resisted centuries of domination from stronger neighbours. They were warriors, traders and pirates, their ships commanding the straits between Greece and Italy. But by the time Gentius rose to power, the Illyrian kingdom was surrounded by giants, Macedon to the east, Rome to the west, and restless Greek states to the south. The world had grown smaller, and empires hungered for control of the Adriatic. Gentius was the son of Pleuratus, a king who had once kept peace with Rome. Yet the young ruler had a different temperament, sharper, more ambitious, and far less willing to bow to foreign influence. From his capital at Skodra, modern Shkodër, Albania, Gentius sought to unify the Illyrian tribes into a single, disciplined power capable of resisting both Greek intrigue and Roman expansion. To the Illyrians, he was a symbol of defiance, an intelligent, proud monarch trying to preserve a nation wedged between empires. But his position was fraught with tension. The Romans watched his every move, remembering earlier Illyrian kings who had defied their authority. Greek states, especially the kingdom of Perseus of Macedon, courted Gentius with promises of alliance against Rome. Caught between the two, the Illyrian king faced a dangerous choice: bend to Roman diplomacy or trust in Macedonian steel. Gentius chose resistance. He began strengthening the Illyrian navy and reorganizing his forces, imposing tighter control over the tribes and coastal cities. His rule was both admired and feared, his justice harsh but consistent. Contemporary Greek accounts describe him as clever but cruel, a monarch whose ambition outpaced his caution. Yet beneath that cold exterior lay the determination of a ruler who refused to let Illyria become another Roman province without a fight. Still, dark clouds gathered over Scodra. Trade faltered under Roman pressure, and alliances proved fickle. What began as a reign of unity slowly turned into a struggle for survival. Gentius would soon discover that the enemies of Illyria were not just across the sea, but within his own borders. His crown, once a symbol of hope, was already becoming a target in a game that no Illyrian king could win. As Gentius tightened his grip over Illyria, his realm became the last independent barrier between Rome and Macedonia, two powers destined to collide. The Adriatic coast was more than a stretch of rocky land. It was the crossroads of trade, strategy, and survival. To the Romans, Illyria was a problem that refused to disappear. To the Macedonians, it was a potential ally in their desperate bid to stop Roman domination of the Balkans. And to Gentius, it was home, one he would not surrender without a fight. The early years of his reign were marked by cautious diplomacy. Gentius maintained formal peace with Rome, even sending envoys to reassure the Senate that Illyria would not interfere in Roman affairs. Yet beneath this surface calm, he was rebuilding. He expanded his fleet, stationed garrisons along the Drin River, and forged alliances with tribal leaders who had long resisted central authority. The Illyrian king's vision was clear: to create a united kingdom strong enough to defend itself without bowing to either empire. But Gentius's ambitions brought suspicion. Roman merchants complained of piracy in the Adriatic, acts Rome blamed on Illyrian captains loyal to Scodra. The Senate, never one to forgive independence, began gathering excuses for intervention. Meanwhile, Gentius found a willing partner in Perseus of Macedon, the last Antigonid king fighting his own war of survival. Their alliance was one born of necessity, not trust. Perseus needed a northern distraction for Rome. Gentius needed Macedonian gold and military backing. The alliance, however, was fragile from the start. Greek states under Roman influence denounced it as reckless, and even within Illyria, chieftains questioned the wisdom of angering the greatest power in the Mediterranean. Still, Gentius believed that unity with Macedonia offered the only hope of preserving Illyrian sovereignty. For a brief moment, the Adriatic trembled with the echoes of Illyrian war drums. Ships were readied, and Roman envoys sent warnings. Gentius dismissed them. "Let Rome cross the mountains," he said to have told his council. "They will not return." But across the sea, the legions were already moving. Rome had crushed Carthage and subdued Greece. Now it turned its gaze toward Illyria, the last free kingdom standing between empire and total dominion. Gentius had chosen his side, and there was no turning back. By 170 BCE, Illyria stood at a crossroads, and King Gentius made his most consequential decision: an alliance with Perseus of Macedon, the last descendant of Alexander's once mighty dynasty. The two rulers shared a single goal: halting Rome's march across the Balkans. But their partnership, born of desperation, would soon reveal how fragile hope could be when balanced against Roman discipline and cunning. At first, the alliance looked promising. Perseus sent envoys to Scodra bearing gifts: gold, fine cloth, and promises of shared glory. Gentius saw in Macedonia a mirror of Illyria's plight: proud, embattled, and surrounded by Roman ambition. The agreement was simple: Illyria would attack Roman allies in the region, disrupting their supply lines, while Perseus faced the legions in Greece. If successful, both kingdoms could restore autonomy to the lands Rome sought to claim. But there was a catch. Perseus, ever cautious, withheld full payment of the promised funds, delaying support until Gentius proved his loyalty. This hesitation proved disastrous. The Illyrian king, pressured by dwindling resources, took aggressive action on his own, imprisoning Roman envoys sent to negotiate. That single act, whether driven by anger or desperation, sealed his fate. In Rome's eyes, it was a declaration of war. Perseus, too, hesitated. His armies stayed fixed in Greece, waiting for Rome to spread itself thin. But the Romans were quicker, richer, and far more organized. They dispatched Lucius Anicius Gallus, a skilled commander, to subdue Illyria before Perseus could react. Within weeks, Roman legions were advancing up the coast, cutting through Illyrian defences with chilling precision. Gentius had overestimated his ally and underestimated his enemy. He believed Perseus would march north to meet him, yet no help came. What had begun as a pact of equals now looked like abandonment. Illyrian soldiers fought bravely but were outnumbered and outmatched by Roman discipline. As Scodra prepared for siege, the king's court grew tense. Whispers spread that Macedon had betrayed them, that gold had been promised but never paid. For Gentius, the alliance that was meant to preserve Illyria now stood as the fatal mistake that would destroy it. And as the Roman banners appeared on the horizon, the young king's faith in diplomacy gave way to the grim resolve of a man preparing for his final stand. By 168 BCE, the storm Gentius had long feared finally broke. The Roman general Lucius Anicius Gallus, leading a seasoned force of legions and allied troops, crossed into Illyria with ruthless efficiency. What the Illyrian king had hoped would be a prolonged war of resistance turned into a lightning campaign. Within less than a month, the Romans dismantled the last Illyrian kingdom piece by piece. Gentius mustered his troops at Scodra, the royal capital nestled between mountains and rivers that had long shielded Illyria from invasion. His warriors, tribesmen hardened by sea raids and hill battles, fought bravely, but Rome's machine of conquest was unstoppable. Its soldiers advanced in tight formations, engineers built bridges across rivers, and supply lines remained unbroken. For every Illyrian stronghold captured, Rome left behind garrisons and banners, a silent declaration that Illyria no longer belonged to itself. As the Romans approached, smaller Illyrian tribes began surrendering, hoping for mercy. Their loyalty to Gentius faltered under the weight of Rome's power. Even worse, his Greek allies deserted him. Perseus of Macedon, now cornered in Greece, sent no reinforcements. The gold he had promised to fund Gentius's army never arrived. Betrayed and isolated, the Illyrian king stood alone. The final stand came at Scodra, where Gentius made one last attempt to rally his people. His wife, Queen Etuta, and his brother Caravantius remained by his side as Roman forces surrounded the city. For days, Illyrian archers rained arrows upon the advancing enemy, their shouts echoing through the valley. But hunger and despair soon replaced defiance. The rivers that had once guarded Scodra now trapped it, cutting off supplies. The Illyrians, famed for their resilience, could not endure the siege forever. When the gates finally opened, Gentius met the Roman envoy not as a warrior, but as a captive king. According to Polybius, he surrendered with dignity, still wearing his royal robes, refusing to kneel. The Romans, impressed yet unmoved, seized his treasury, fleet, and family. Illyria was broken. The kingdom that had once ruled the Adriatic, that had defied empires and built cities of stone, was no more. With Gentius's capture, the line of Illyrian kings ended, and with it, the sovereignty of a people who had ruled the mountains and seas for centuries. After the siege of Scodra, King Gentius, his queen Etuta, and their children were taken prisoner by the Romans. The conqueror, Lucius Anicius Gallus, treated them with the formal courtesy reserved for fallen royalty. But beneath that civility lay humiliation. The Illyrian king, who had once commanded fleets across the Adriatic, was now a trophy of war, paraded to showcase Rome's supremacy. Gentius and his family were sent first to Corcyra, modern Corfu, and then across the Ionian Sea to Italy. The journey itself was a spectacle. Roman ships, their decks lined with soldiers, carried the royal captives as living proof that Illyria had fallen. Along the coasts, towns cheered their arrival, not out of respect, but curiosity. A defeated king was a rare and thrilling sight. For Gentius, every wave that struck the hull was a reminder of how swiftly fortune could turn against a crown. In Rome, the Senate celebrated another swift conquest. The Illyrian campaign had lasted only 30 days, a remarkable victory that demonstrated the might and efficiency of the Republic. Gentius was forced to appear in the triumph of Anicius Gallus, walking in chains through the streets of the capital as crowds jeered. Ancient writers noted his composure. He did not plead, nor did he cry out. There was pride even in defeat, though it must have burned within him like iron. After the triumph, Gentius and his family were sent to Spoletium, modern Spoleto, in central Italy, where they lived under house arrest. For a man born to rule, confinement was a slow death. Yet some sources hint that the Romans treated him with a degree of respect, recognizing in him not a rebel, but a fallen monarch. His younger brother Caravantius, who had fought beside him, was imprisoned as well, his fate likely the same, captivity until death. The Illyrian crown, meanwhile, was dismantled piece by piece. Roman administrators divided the land into districts, disarming the tribes and taxing the ports that had once filled Gentius's coffers. Scodra became a provincial outpost. From the grandeur of kingship to the silence of captivity, Gentius's story reflected the fate of his people. Proud, resilient, but ultimately consumed by Rome's relentless expansion. His throne was gone, but his defiance, recorded even by his enemies, ensured that his name would not vanish entirely from history. With Gentius imprisoned and Illyria subdued, Rome moved swiftly to erase the last traces of independence from the once proud kingdom. What had begun as a campaign of punishment turned into the systematic dismantling of Illyrian power. The Senate divided the territory into administrative regions, each directly governed by Roman officials or loyal local chieftains who had surrendered early. The purpose was simple. No Illyrian king would ever rise again. The Illyrian navy, once feared for its swift Lemby ships that raided Greek and Italian coasts, was burned or captured. Ports like Lissus, Scodra, and Rhizon, once bustling with traders and warriors, became Roman outposts. The Adriatic, once called Mare Illyricum, now served as a Roman highway. Trade that once enriched Illyrian merchants now filled Roman treasuries. The people who had controlled these waters for centuries were reduced to subjects within a vast and foreign empire. Rome's victory also served a political purpose. The conquest of Illyria sent a message across the Mediterranean. Resistance was futile. Neighbouring tribes and Greek city-states, watching the rapid fall of Scodra, began pledging loyalty to Rome without a fight. Even Perseus of Macedon, Gentius's abandoned ally, fell soon after at the Battle of Pydna. Within months, both Macedonia and Illyria, the last buffers between Rome and the East, were gone. For Illyria, the loss was not only political, but cultural. The Romans imposed their language, currency, and legal systems, slowly eroding the tribal structures that had defined Illyrian identity. Local kings and warriors were replaced by governors and tax collectors. Young Illyrians were conscripted into Roman auxiliary forces, fighting wars in lands they had never heard of. The rhythm of life, once shaped by the seasons, trade winds, and clan loyalty, now pulsed to the beat of Roman command. Yet even in defeat, the spirit of Illyria lingered. Roman generals noted that uprisings continued for decades, fueled by memories of the old kings. Songs were still sung of Gentius, the last monarch who had dared to stand against the empire. By the time Rome declared the province of Illyricum, the transformation was complete. The Illyrian name survived, but the kingdom was gone. The land of mountains and sailors had become another stone in Rome's growing mosaic of conquest. Its independence traded for the hollow peace of submission. Every fallen kingdom has its traitors, and for Gentius, betrayal came not from his enemies, but from those who had sworn friendship. When the Illyrian king looked east for help, he found Perseus of Macedon, the last of Alexander's successors, whose silver tongue promised strength and unity against Rome. Yet when Illyria bled, Macedonia stood idle. The gold Perseus had pledged to fund Illyria's army never arrived, and the soldiers Gentius expected to march north never came. What began as an alliance of